Cool. Okay, we should be good to go. All right, welcome to the Praxis Behind the Obscure podcast. And today I have a special guest. I have Magee, and he recently wrote a book, Kali Magic, which I recently got a copy of. And he has an extensive background in Tantra. He was also involved in Kenneth Grant OTO. So instead of me, introducing yourself, can you give the listeners a bit of a background on how you initially got interested in esoteric topics? Maybe you can share a little bit about your time in with Kenneth Grant and the OTO, and then how you ended up transitioning into your focus now, which is currently Tantra.
Okay. Well, I'm 73 years old, so 73 years young now, definitely old. I first got interested in the esoteric when this is a strange story. My dad was a staunch Roman Catholic, but he was stationed in India during the Second World War, and he was in the RAF, and he was on sentry duty one night, and the Sadhu came up to him and said, my dad had pretty good Hindi, I think. The Sadhu came up to him and my dad said, stop, who goes there? And the Sadhu said, me and my ancestors trod this path for generations and generations, and I'd like to ask you to let me through. And my dad said no. And so the Sadhu cursed him. He said, you're going to have 3 children. They're all going to be boys. And the second one is going to become a Sadhu himself. So that kind of intrigued me a bit. Another aspect of that was that my uncle used to run the Northwest Indian Railways and lived a short distance away from where I was born in Aberdeen. And in his house was full of Indian stuff, which really fascinated me. So that's, I think, is kind of how I became to be interested. But in fact, I only developed an interest in Hinduism and Tantra in 1974, when I had a lucid dream where a mantra was transmitted to me, and the dream stopped becoming lucid, and I woke up and the mantra was still vibrating in me. And so I was in Kenneth Grant's OTO then. So I thought to myself, this probably bears a bit more investigation.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, interesting.
So I got very interested in the topic. And of course, Kenneth Grant was actually very knowledgeable about Tantra, but up until then, we never really had a discussion about these traditions. And so that fundamentally changed my attitude. Whereas I was formerly interested in Western esotericism, I began to learn Sanskrit and study more deeply the Tantric traditions.
Okay. So you obviously, as a youth, you explain a little bit about your experience and getting interested in it. However, you said prior to that, you were involved in the OTO. Can you share a little bit about that journey? Maybe, the time you spent with Kenneth Grant and your experiences in Western esotericism as well.
Sure. Well, I think I first got interested in Grant's work when the Magical Revival came out. And I wrote to him and said, was there any way to join his OTO? And at first he said, no, absolutely not. But I persisted. And I lived in Leeds, Yorkshire then, and moved to London. And in fact, the place we lived at was only maybe 10 minutes walk away from Kenneth Grant's house. And he did agree to allow me to become a candidate for membership, which involved doing a 9-month magical practice, writing it down in a diary and then presenting it to Kenneth Grant or one of the other senior members for assessment. But I think then there were only maybe 2 or 3 senior members. The most senior lived in the United States. And I think that, in hindsight, I think that Kenneth OTO only started to recruit very shortly before I joined. And so at one point, we lived in Golders Green in London. At one point, I was seeing Kenneth maybe once a fortnight, sometimes once a week. And he came around to my place and I went around to his place. It was usually that way around. And we talked and talked and talked about all sorts of things.
That's pretty fascinating. what would you say were perhaps the biggest takeaways from spending so much time around Kenneth Grant?
Phew. Well, first of all, the guy was serious. I mean, to progress through his grades, you had to do a similar thing. So you had to do a 9-month exercise for every grade, essentially for every grade. And eventually, I introduced quite a few people to Kenneth OTO, including Mick Staley, who, as you probably know, runs the whole thing these days. And I was impressed by his seriousness and the way the depth of knowledge he had. I wasn't so impressed by the stuff about Cthulhu and Lovecraft, which I never really cottoned onto. It really wasn't my thing. But his approach was impressive, and his hospitality was impressive too.
Okay. Would you say that the training that you did with Kenneth Grant and the OTO, did that in any way help you or prepare you for your later endeavors in Tantra?
It certainly did help, yeah. I think up till then I'd been a bit of a dilettante, like a lot of people interested in the Western tradition are, and dabbled here and there, but never had a definitive task to do or discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So that convinced me that in order to engage in the esoteric, you really do need to kind of knuckle down and do the work rather than just have these fantasies rolling around in your head, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So the tipping point you said was really that lucid dream that, you sort of woke up to that was still happening, right? That was kind of like the tipping point where you sort of transitioned from being very involved in Western esotericism into Hindu Tantra, right?
Right, that's right. Yeah.
So how did from that point, how did your path develop? You mentioned that you started studying Sanskrit. Maybe you can share a little bit about how that journey developed too from there.
Well, first of all, I wondered about this transmission because, of course, the texts generally say you have to have transmission through a guru, although there are exceptions. And I was still in Kenneth OTO, but studying these different topics.
Mm-hmm.
And one day I had a letter from a guy in India who had seen an advert for the magazine I was editing at the time in an Indian magazine. And he wrote to me and introduced himself as a member of the Adinath Sampradaya. And so I actually went to visit him. I left a pretty good job in India and left to visit him in 1978. And I wasn't really asking for initiation, but he did initiate me into the Adinath tradition. And when I got back, it might have been before I went, but I think it was when I got back, I wrote a letter to Kenneth saying, really, I think I should leave your OTO with absolutely no hard feelings and pursue this particular path. And actually, he was very gracious and said he understood. So that's the kind of way it went.
Okay. Okay. Then from there, did you continue with the same teacher that you received that initiation from, or did you kind of
Yes.
go about like, okay, you continue with the same teacher for quite a long time?
Yeah, he said to me, this is not something I wanted to do.
Mm-hmm.
He said to me, I want you to start a magical order in the West, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
A graded order, actually a bit like the OTO. And so he had me write a whole series of grade papers, largely based on my own experience, but with elements from the Nath Sampradaya as well. This really wasn't something I wanted to do, to start another bloody order, but it did kind of take off, and had quite a few members, and took up an awful lot of time actually. And there are still people all over the world that are following that Amukos path. Although these days I have very little to do with it, and I don't initiate people. And as far as I'm concerned, that phase of my life is over.
Okay. Okay. were there any like major changes in your view? So previously coming from the Western esotericism into this sort of, being immersed in Tantra, receiving initiation, did you experience any major change in your view on things? Maybe you can share if there were any notable changes.
I think possibly the most notable change is that I'm very much of the view these days that it's not Advaita Vedanta, it's a Kashmir Shaivite kind of Vedanta where it's very difficult to explain this, excuse me, where the inner pulse of what you are, of the I am in you, is the predominant force and excuse me, in every living being. But getting to realize that is very, very difficult, mostly because of the obstacles we set ourselves with our mindsets and our physical body armoring and things like that, and also the way we're influenced by other people and the way sense impressions interfere with being lucid.
Okay, maybe you can share a little bit about what sort of practices are involved in Tantra. What are, obviously you have Western, what would you say, like neo-Tantra, where it's sort of it's almost like another thing within itself. It's not really even really related to the original Tantra, but maybe you can share a little bit about the practices that you started engaging with, and share a little bit about that.
You've read my book Kali Magic, and some of the procedures and the pujas, the worships, are extremely elaborate. Extremely elaborate. Maybe having to.
Maybe you can define what is a puja. Can you define that for the listeners?
Okay, a puja is a ritual where you have either an image of the god or goddess or a yantra, like the yantra that's behind me, and you place the image or the yantra in a position, normally facing east, but in Kali's case facing north, and then you do some preliminary rites to kind of fence the directions and create a sphere in which you'll be doing the working. Then this is a very shortened version, actually. It's a very elaborate ritual if you carry it out entirely. Then you visualize the aspect of the god or goddess in your heart. Take a flower to your left nostril and then place it onto the yantra or the image, and do some invocation, so that now that image or that yantra actually represents the deva or the devi. And then there follow a series of offerings. There can be as much as 16 offerings or as little as 5 to the different parts of the yantra. And then you can recite the mantra. And some of these mantras, the prescription is you have to recite them 100,000 times, but maybe not all in one section. And then when you've done the puja, you take the flower back to your nose, invoke it again into your heart, invoke the deva or devi into your heart, and then do things to clear the space, to disperse the space. And then the offerings that you've given, if they're food, you can share them with other people. If they're not food, you can throw them in water and dispose of them. So in brief, that's what a puja is.
Okay. So pujas are one of the major practices. Are there any other practices you can share? Tantra has sort of this smorgasbord of different tools and techniques that it utilizes, but what are some other tools or techniques?
I'll get onto that in a second, but this puja that I just described to you is called Oto puja, and the aim is to do inner puja, so you don't need any of the paraphernalia, but you do the rite actually within yourself. As for the other things, you're right, it's a smorgasbord, and if you want to kill people or subjugate people or create a magical sword that will defend you against everything or fly in the sky, well, there are all sorts of prescriptions for those kind of things, although I think they should probably be taken with a pinch of salt.
Yeah,
In the Kali tradition, there's animal sacrifice, but the inner text, the commentaries, explain animal sacrifice as sacrifice of different bad things inside yourself. So human sacrifice is actually sacrificing the ego, and the other animals represent other elements that you want to get rid of, obstacles to your progress.
There's also quite a lot of deities. So, for example, in your book, you focus on Kali, but there are, hundreds and hundreds of other deities. Have you experienced working with different deities? And if so, what are they sort of different lenses that one takes on? Would that be appropriate way of describing it?
There are actually millions.
Yeah, millions. Yeah.
Basically, the idea is that all gods are aspects of Deva, all goddesses are aspects of Devi, and then those two united are the reality. So, if, for example, I'll get onto the other goddesses and gods in a minute, but so if you have an Indian image of a goddess, she has maybe 12 arms or 4 arms, or some even have 108 arms. And there are attributes of a particular aspect. So it's the iconography that's important. By looking at the weapons she holds, you get an idea of the kind of aspect that she represents, even though she's still the only one goddess. And I've actually worked with my primary Devi that I've worked with is Tripura Sundari, also called Lalita, and she represents a tradition called Sri Vidya, which has a far more complicated, the yantra has a far more complicated structure than the Kali yantra that's behind me. And the rituals are actually quite elaborate too. There's also a lot of inner work, meditations and practices that you can do too. And that scholars believe that the Sri Vidya tradition is actually related to the Kashmir traditions of the 10th, 11th century AD.
Yeah, Tantra is pretty extensive. There are different schools in terms of, obviously there's Buddhist Tantra, which is a whole different, category in itself. But in terms of Hindu, you have like Trika Shaivism, Kashmiri Shaivism, Kaula. So are there major differences between these traditions in terms of their views and practices?
Yeah, there are some sharp divisions in the sphere of Sri Vidya. Sri Vidya is still practiced quite extensively in South India, but they condemn tantras that Sri Vidya tantras that have the triangle in the center of the yantra pointing downwards, because they think that's a bit naughty. So their Sri yantra is the triangle facing upwards, and commentaries in the South Indian tradition really condemn an awful lot of the practices that form the core tradition that probably originated from Kashmir. And then, I mean, there are so many different schools and cults that it'd be impossible to measure them, and I probably don't know about most of them. My particular tradition, the Nath tradition, is actually based on the Kaula tradition, which precedes Trika Shaivism by maybe a couple of hundred of years.
Okay.
And in a book that's attributed to Matsyendranath, who's supposed to be the founder of the Nath traditions, he describes what are essentially Kaula practices, including worship of the goddess with flowers and inner meditations and that kind of thing. And in actual fact, in some books on Tantra, the whole situation becomes even more confused, because in some Tantras, they mention how a sage called Vashishta went to Assam and got initiated by a Buddha, and found that all the practitioners up there were drinking wine and holding Kaula circles and generally having a good time. And Matsyendranath, who's supposed to be the founder of the Nath Sampradaya, the legend these days is that Gorakhnath, who's the most well-known of the Nath teachers, rescued Matsyendranath from a similar place where he was having too good a time and brought him back to the Orthodox. But I think that's a way of presenting the tradition as being more acceptable to ordinary people, because I'm still in contact with Naths of other divisions. There's 12 main divisions in the Nath Sampradaya, and they, I'm sure, have inner practices that don't necessarily disclose them to people outside the circle.
Okay, so a lot of these practices, while some of them are published, many of them may be secret, or one needs to receive initiation and explanation for some of these practices, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. What role does the one's guru play in this tradition?
The idea is a radical idea expressed in some of the tantras is you've got to kill your guru, and by that I mean becoming realized yourself and not having to rely on any external person. In some ways, I guess I could regard Kenneth Grant as my guru, if I wanted to look at it that way. In fact, one of the saints of India, a being called Dattatreya, said he had 24 gurus, and he described them as being like the wind and water and sparrows and cows and all other things. So I think the basic idea is you can learn and should learn from everything that you experience, really. But you pay reverence to your own living guru, because he or she ought to represent the spirit, the true self.
Okay. Well, what would you say is the goal of tantric practice? Like, so for example, in like Buddhist tantra, you're aiming towards Buddhahood, right? Basically liberation or enlightenment, right? Would you say the goals are quite similar in Hindu Tantra, or do they diverge? Moksha, perhaps?
I believe that there are great similarities, actually. The aim in Indian Tantras, by and large, is realization, and that realization means you're in touch with the greater cosmos. And so the idea is when you leave your body, when you die, you don't get reborn. That's one of the ideas. I don't know if it's true because I can't remember. I guess I'll find it enough.
You're still alive and breathing here, so
just about, yeah.
Okay, that's good. That's good. One other factor is the non-dual view. Is that very important in this tradition as well? As you mentioned a little bit earlier, that sort of like tapping into that inner self, right? In this tradition that you're a part of, is there a non-dual view? In other words, are there sort of progressive views, like seeing the deity as separate, and then maybe later seeing the deity as one with oneself, or is it more? Is there a specific view that evolves over time, or is there one view that you're supposed to instill during these practices?
I don't think there's any supposed to in it actually, and some think that you don't need to do anything, and sometimes it comes to you in a form called sahaja, which means spontaneous, and sahaja is actually the root of the word Zen and the Chinese tradition too. So realization can come in a second or a fraction of a second, and or it may not. It's always there. The idea is that inside each one of us, that seed is there, just waiting to blossom. So if you get rid of conditioning and you do practices designed to remove obstacles, inner obstacles, then the idea is that realization, which is always there, becomes real.
Okay. Okay. So your last book, or your most recent book, is Kali Magic, and maybe can you share a little bit to the listeners about, who is Kali, what are the traits of Kali, and what what sort of function does Kali serve?
Well, most people have heard of Kali because of her image.
And Kali Yuga, right?
Well, Kali Yuga is actually nothing to do with Kali.
Oh, yeah.
It's a different word, spelled differently in Sanskrit. And Kali is generally conceived to be terrifying and the personification of darkness and destruction. But there's an inner side to Kali that's much deeper than that. This yantra behind me, in the triangles behind me, there are 15 different forms of Kali called the nityas or eternities, and they're associated with the waxing moon. And Lalita also has 15 nityas associated with the waxing moon. And so the two, Lalita and Kali, Lalita's the good girl, Kali's the bad girl,
Okay.
form one unity and just represent the different phases of movement and eternity. And she's still very much worshipped in India, specifically in West Bengal, but all over India she's still revered. And I think to a Hindu who reveres Kali, she or he would be very offended by the way she's portrayed in the West generally.
Yeah, what do you mean by that? Can you elaborate?
Well, she's portrayed as being like a demon or a demoness, and so you find stuff in books and stuff in films portraying her not as the divine mother of the universe, which devout Hindus regard her as, but as some kind of cartoon figure who personifies evil, and that's definitely not the way that Hindus see Kali.
Okay, interesting. For some reason, I have an association with Kali, or I did have an association as like a destructive force, sort of like a black hole that swallows everything. Is that often a representation, or did I have some sort of weird preconception?
I think that's a fair view, actually. It's a fair view. She's a bit like a black hole. She's a bit like death. I think one of the greatest taboos, certainly in Western society, is death. We in India is completely different. Death is everywhere, and when a Hindu dies, they're burnt in full view of anybody that happens to be around. But over here, it's still surrounded by taboo. So somebody dies and there's a funeral, but we don't really face death as perhaps we could. Obviously, it's frightening. As I said before, I don't know what's going to happen when I croak, but you have to face it, and that's part of her attribute.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So this tradition you're a part of, is this a continual tradition? In other words, as you mentioned, it kind of predates Trika Shaivism, right, or Kashmiri Shaivism. And is there like a lineage that continued, or was it kind of broken over time and revived?
It's not entirely clear, actually. Matsyendranath, maybe the 9th century AD. But before then, there were sadhus who seemed to act in a similar way, perform similar rituals, but like the Kapalikas. But there's no actual unbroken link from BC to now. Although Hindus generally believe that these traditions do go back thousands of years, and in fact, Alexander the Great encountered what the Greeks called gymnosophists when he invaded northwest India back in the day, and these were naked sadhus who obviously had similarities to the sadhus that still exist in India today.
Oh, interesting. Like these practices, like the puja that you had explained, and these specific practices, were they mostly preserved in orally, or were they also written down, like codified into sort of books or tantras?
Well, isn't that interesting? Because the tantras usually start as a dialogue between Shiva and Shakti, where Shakti asks Shiva questions and then he drones on about whatever she's asked him about. But and some people believe this, that these tantras are actually divine texts, but there are so many of them. Was some voyeur sort of listening into the conversation between Shiva and Shakti and then writing it all?
Eavesdropping on the conversation.
Yeah, that's right. And there are different tantras of different traditions, of different goddesses, of different gods, and they all share. Most of them share a similar pattern, but I think the original idea was oral transmission, and over time it fragmented and it became textual, and that might have been down in part to the invasions of the Mongols in the second millennium. Second millennium, is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Not too sure.
From 10,000 to 10,000 to 2,000, yeah. Because a friend of mine and a scholar called Mark Tchaikovsky, I had conversations with him, and he said that a lot of the temples were looted and possessions carted away. But he said people still practice, but they maybe worship the goddess not in a physical yantra, just by drawing a triangle on the palm of their hand and worshipping the goddess there. And so that's an oral thing rather than a written thing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, interesting. How does Tantra sort of differ from like the mainstream Vedic Hinduism, right? So you have like the Vedas and the Upanishads, then you have like Tantra kind of branched off from that, right? What are there major differences in terms of the practices, or the schools from what would be considered like mainstream, like Vedic Hinduism?
Well, most of the rituals performed in temples in India are actually based on tantric and Puranic practices rather than Vedic practices, with some exceptions like casting offerings into a fire pit is a Vedic idea. But in actual fact, the Vedas don't really form part of a regular Hindu's practice, and apart from Orthodox Brahmins who presumably stick to the Vedic rites. The Tantras adopt some of the Vedic principles, but I believe I think that's because they want to present a more positive spin on the Tantras and somehow link it in with previous traditions. But there's not much that's Vedic in any of the Tantras.
Okay, sort of departure from sort of what would you say, mainstream. So Tantra is for householders particularly, right? It's not, or for yogis, right? It's not necessarily institutionalized, I guess. Is that the right word I'm looking for?
Yeah, it varies. I was in Korea once, couple of decades ago, and somebody took us up to the hills and in the Shilla region, and took us to Mahayana monastery, and there were both men and women living together and worshipping together. And I think that happened in India as well until comparatively recent times. And there are female naths, and there still are female naths, but not as many as there were. And generally speaking, I guess Tantra is not restricted to, but generally practiced by householders, but by different types of yogis as well, who have incorporated some of the practices.
Who are typically, is there like, if one is interested in Tantra, are there any prerequisites, I guess is the question I was looking for. Like, in other words, are there certain types of people who are supposed to engage in it, or is it sort of a practice open for all people?
I think it's open for all people who take an interest.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the word Tantra has been a bit muddled by the Neo-Tantra people. So around the corner, there's a place that teaches you all about the chakras and Kundalini and Neo-Tantra, which is so far away from the core practice as to be practically unrecognizable to anybody that understands the Tantra that isn't Neo-Tantra. Sex, it's about sex, isn't it? And sex comes into Tantra, but so does food and shitting and eating and dying.
Right.
It's just a part of the whole thing.
Right. Do Kundalini practices and the chakras, do those play any role in Tantra?
They reckon so, yeah. I've had a Kundalini experience myself, and it's really enough. It's really enough. But I think again that's there's an element of spontaneity in that, and it's not something you can do. There's no practice that you can do visualizations in the different chakras. But of course, as you probably know, there's many different number of chakras depending on the tradition.
Sure.
In Buddhism and in Nath Tantrism and in the more generally adopted one is the one in John Woodruff's Serpent Power with 7 chakras. The one at the top of your head being the one where you're liberated. But I wouldn't say it's a goal. No.
Okay. What role does Sanskrit? So Sanskrit is sort of the language of the Tantras, right? That's the language that is utilized in the pujas and the mantras, right?
Yeah.
What is the importance of Sanskrit? Can one chant these or do these practices in English or in Hindi, or if not, why is Sanskrit so integral to these practices?
Most of the tantras are written in Sanskrit. But luckily, it's very simple Sanskrit, so I can understand it. I mean, high-flown Sanskrit is very, very difficult to comprehend and to learn. I think you can practice these things in any language, actually. But the significance of Sanskrit in the Tantric tradition is that the different letters of the alphabet are all thought of as being aspects of the deity with their own particular attribute and their own particular form. A bit like maybe the Kabbalists thought of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. You've got numinosity, they glow by themselves. And those letters, and actually getting back to Kali, around her neck and her image, she wears the 51 skulls, which represent the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet. But it's iconography, it's symbolism,
Okay, interesting. So you are you fluent? You studied Sanskrit extensively, correct? And you've done a lot of translation, right?
I've done a lot of translation of tantras, but like I just said, that they're all written in very simple Sanskrit. So I've got basic Sanskrit. I wouldn't describe myself as an expert in Sanskrit. Far from it. Far from it. You show me one of the other. I've got books behind me in Sanskrit that I can't really make head nor tail of. They're so subtle, if you get me. Whereas the tantras are very simple. They don't use very many verb forms. They're short. Generally speaking, they're short.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. So your last book is on Kali magic. Did you have any inspiration for writing this book? What is your inspiration for writing? And I believe the previous one, I don't have a copy of that, but I think it was called Lakshmi magic. Is that correct?
Yakshini magic, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
What would you say
yeah.
is inspiration behind writing these, and who would be? I mean, who is like your target audience for these books?
Well, I don't really know. I don't really know. Yakshini magic is about essentially nature spirits,
Mhm.
and I wrote about that. I wrote that book because I had a friend over here, and just outside my back door, there's an apple tree,
Mhm.
and she said that's an image of a yakshini on your apple tree, Mike. And there was a vague similarity to a female nature spirit there,
Mhm.
and the yakshinis are mentioned in the Tantras. So I thought I'd write this book about the yakshinis, and I enjoyed writing that one. The
Mhm.
Kali book, is a compilation of previous books I've written, much shorter books, but with much more material added to this particular book.
Mhm.
The target audience, I guess, would be any esoterist that's interested in the Eastern traditions, and it ought to be of interest to readers in India as well.
Mhm.
It's available in India. I don't think it's going to be a bestseller, though.
Yeah, but there are a lot of like practical. There's a lot of practical information and practices in these, or in the last book for sure, right? So it does
Yeah,
seem like it's meant to not necessarily only be theoretical, academia or knowledge, but rather something that one can put directly into practice, right?
yeah. I mean, I wanted to make it clear in Kali Magic that um, scholars, generally speaking, scholars don't include the gruesome stuff like the spells and the invocations and the curses that a tantric is supposed to be able to inflict, and they stay away from the messy stuff like sex. So you get a book written about there's a tantra called the Netra Tantra, which is a Kashmir Shaivite text.
Mhm.
It contains some philosophy, but it also contains a lot of magic.
Mhm.
And in a way, I wanted to show in this book that there's more to Tantra than philosophy.
Mhm.
It's a magical tradition
Mhm.
as well as a philosophical tradition.
Okay. Um, have you experimented a lot with these sort of sorcery, these magical techniques? And if so, are there any major differences with, your previous experience in Western magic? Are there a lot of differences with this, tantric magic and sorcery?
I haven't done any sorcery,
Okay.
so, so I wouldn't know. I mean, the segue from Kenneth Grant OTO to the tantric tradition is actually quite a smooth one.
Hmm.
Uh, in his later books, he does introduce quite a few tantric concepts, doesn't he?
Hmm.
So I never cursed anybody, so I wouldn't know.
Hmm.
And I I'm not particularly interested in using 7 league boots to traverse great distances, or you know.
Yeah, sure. It's not necessarily your thing. Yeah.
So,
Okay. Interesting. So you mentioned that the main deity you work with is not actually Kali, right? You had mentioned it's another deity, I think, a bit earlier. What was the name?
Lalita, Lalita, Lalita,
Oh, okay.
also also known as Tripura Sundari,
Mhm.
and she, if Kali is death, Lalita is sex. Um, she's she's supposed to be very beneficent
Mhm.
and kind, and she creates rather than destroys. So she's, you know, she's one half the same coin, really.
Okay. So it's sort of like in Buddhist Tantra, you have like the wrathful deities and the peaceful deities, right? So something
Yeah.
like Chinrazig is a peaceful deity, and something like Shakrazambar is a wrathful with the fire and the fangs and the skulls, right? Vajrayogini, things like that. So the same concept in the Hindu Tantra, there are these wrathful and peaceful deities. Can one alternate these practices depending on one's um, current circumstances? Is that common to work through these different practices, or does one sort of kind of stick out one or stick with one, and that's like your deity?
Yeah, the concept is actually Vajrayogini is a devi in some of the Indian tantric traditions as well. Everyone's supposed to have an Ishta Devata, which means a particular aspect of the god or the goddess that's suitable for her or for him. But as I said before, as all goddesses and all gods are aspects of one principle, and actually a non-dual principle. In theory, I'm sure it's possible to switch from one to another.
Okay.
But the advice is to stick with one. Stick with one.
Okay. How about for you though? Did you like experiment around with different ones and like find the one that you wanted to stick with, or was it sort of this is the one you received the transmission and that's the one you kind of stuck out the whole time?
She's the one that transmitted the mantra in my lucid dreams. So
Okay.
she's the one for me.
Okay. Is it kind of like the deity chose you, not necessarily you chose the deity, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Um, are you working on another project in relation to that Lalita practice?
Yeah, my next book is called Lalita Magic. And it's maybe 80% complete. There's a lot more work to do on it, but my publisher won't let me stop.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, to put it in a more positive way, he's encouraging me to carry on writing these books, and I will write this book, and I have another book in the pipeline on Hindu astrology as well, which has a much bigger part in Hindu Tantra than many people realize.
Interesting. Can you share a little bit about that? Like in what way does astrology play a role? Like, are there certain practices or certain things you're supposed to do depending on the day and the moon cycles and what have you?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
There are prescriptions in the Tantra Raja Tantra, which is an important Sri Vidya Tantra, which narrow down the exact time you have to do certain practices. And then there's the of course in Hinduism the planets are gods as well, and even the constellations or the rashis are considered to be forms of gods too. So some people, there are tantras based on the worship of Mars or Venus or Saturn, and so certain days will be more important to a particular tantric than another, and you have to have a basic knowledge of Hindu astrology to be able to do the practice, or know somebody that can tell you.
Interesting. Is there a big crossover between Western? I mean, even Western astrology has so many different schools and interpretations, right? But are there a lot of similarities, or do they totally differ in approach?
They're very different, mostly because the two zodiacs are different. The Hindus use the sidereal zodiac, which is based on the actual position of the stars, while Western astrology, generally speaking, has the first point of Aries as the spring equinox, and the zodiacs differ by 24 degrees or so. So your sun in the west could be in Scorpio, but in the east could be in Libra. So there's quite a big difference. And when somebody asks you for your birth sign in India, a Hindu asks you, you don't say your sun sign, you say your moon sign. And in actual fact, until quite recently, the first name of your child, the letters of the alphabet are associated with the phases of the moon. And the first letter of your child's name contains a consonant and a syllable, which you have to use in that person's name. So in the old days, you could tell where a person's moon was by just asking that first name.
Oh, that's very interesting. Okay. Wow. I haven't heard that before. That's an interesting bit of information. If one was looking to get some sort of initiation or transmission of these practices and tantras, is there a way to go about that? Or can one sort of self-initiate, or can one directly initiate with that deity? So for example, if it's Kali, could somebody directly work with Kali one, I guess you would say one-on-one, or would they need to go through like a lineage holder or a guru?
I believe that self-initiation is possible, yeah. And perhaps all initiation is self-initiation, because you have to have that urge inside you, that desire inside you to seek some kind of answer to the question that's bothering you. As for lineages, it's true to say that the Nath tradition has a lineage, so it's passed on from master to disciple, and has been for many hundreds of years. But not all yogis or tantrics want to initiate other people or desire to initiate other people. So I think it's I have initiated people into the Nath tradition, and they do have the ability to pass on the lineage, but that doesn't necessarily mean passing on the knowledge which has to come from inside, really. And having a badge doesn't necessarily make any difference. So it's like a lot of people. I noticed before I became interested in the Indian traditions, I noticed a lot of people kind of wore these order badges as if they were medals, and you don't need to dress a certain way or behave in a certain way to realize yourself, I'm sure.
Okay. We kind of started with your dream being this major, segue into your explorations of Tantra. Are there any ways that dreams play a role? So, for example, like in Vajrayana Buddhism, there's the practice of dream yoga, right, where one actively uses dreams as part of an extension of one's practice, right? Are there similar practices, dream practices, in this tradition as well?
I don't know too much about the Buddhist traditions, but there certainly are in the Hindu ones. There's a goddess called Svatnavati, and that Svatna means sleep, dreams, and it's she who flies in dreams, and lucid dreams, I think, are a part of that tradition too. You're supposed to be able to. This is a bit complicated philosophically. There are said to be three states: the waking state, now, the dream state, which is when you fly around in dreams, and deep sleep. Those are the three stages that human beings experience. But there's a fourth, which encompasses them all, because Tantra is very much based on the idea of a triangle, and that's the basis. So, like I said, I don't know much about the Buddhist dream practices, but they certainly exist in the Indian tradition. Okay,
cool. So you mentioned that you have a couple books in the pipeline, right? The one on Hindu astrology and another one on the Lalita practice, right? How can people go about if somebody wanted to, find your work, or do you have a website that you can promote to the listeners, and how can people go about contacting you as well?
I do have a website. It's called shivashakti.com, and there's a whole lot of information on there. Some of the information hasn't been published except on the website, and it's been around for 20 years or so. So people could look there just to see if the subject interests them.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'll definitely post that in the show notes, for sure. I'm also curious too. I guess I have a couple more questions, but I'm curious, you spend all this time in the OTO too. Are there still elements of those practices or experiences that you bring with you today, or you hold on to today, or have you sort of, would you say you like fully closed that chapter of that book, so to speak?
I think, like I said before, that one of the things I learned from Kenneth Grant's methods was discipline, and I think I've carried that through. For example, one of the tasks you had to do to proceed to a certain grade was to take a particular aspect of a god or a goddess. It could be any god or goddess, and perform essentially a nine-month daily practice based on that god or goddess. So that in some ways is very similar to what happens in the tantric traditions. In fact, when I did that, the goddess I worshipped was Hathor, obviously an Egyptian goddess, but goddess is a goddess is a goddess is a goddess,
Yeah, for sure. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. This has been very enlightening, and I feel like I learned a lot from this. Are there any other things you want to mention or promote, or any final thoughts or final words?
I don't think so, actually. Ryan, I think I fancy going for a wee and having a cigarette.
That sounds like a good idea. Well, I really enjoyed this. Hopefully, maybe when your next books come out, like the one on astrology and the one on Lolita, I would definitely enjoy having another conversation based on those when those are released. So hopefully, we can keep in touch and have like a round two at some point.
Thanks for giving me the time of day, man.
Oh yeah, definitely. Okay. Well, until next time.
Bye.
Okay, take it easy. Yeah, take care.
Yeah, bye.
Yeah.